Are you or someone you know struggling with deconstruction? You struggling with questions? Watch this.
I have always been a naturally skeptical person. So even in the midst of a very vibrant Christian faith, I would have doubts. I'd hear a little something about how the Bible came together, how the 27 books of the New Testament were kind of put together and the way that, the canon came together. And I'd be like, this doesn't seem as clean as maybe I thought that it might have been. I would think a little bit about the resurrection of Jesus and I'd be like, that's a tough thing. It's a tough thing, but that's the whole point. It's tough. I have faith. I would do what I think a lot of Christians do is that when you have a doubt about something, you go and you read a Christian expert. They've been to seminary, they've written books, and they spend their life studying this stuff. And they put out a lot of material that, and they're smarter than me, and they are more knowledgeable than me. So what I would do is I would just go and I would find somebody who was smarter than me and they would be like, oh no, it's very reasonable to believe this. There's very good reason to believe this. And that would kind of plaster over my doubt in that particular area for a while. You got this big umbrella of Christianity, and the whole idea is that we've got the truth. The whole point is we have the ultimate truth, right? As Christians, God has revealed the ultimate truth to us. This is what I believed. But yet within that camp, there are these two wildly different perspectives on basically the entire natural world. And I was like, something about this is alarming because this isn't as clean as I thought it was. Story. Plus, Genesis presents all this stuff straight from Adam and Eve, and you go through all the generations. Even the Gospel of Luke, the genealogy of Jesus, features Adam. So this, if you don't believe in Adam and Eve, like where do you start believing it, right? So I knew I couldn't let go of that. But let me just say, this made me just question like all this stuff, you've been told all this stuff, like I had been told that there were no transitional fossils. There were no transitional forms. There's no transitional between this animal and this animal. Well, it turns out there's a lot of them. There's a lot of very convincing ones. But the thing that did for me is I had placed a lot of faith, not just in God, but in these people who helped me understand why I believed what I believed from an intellectual standpoint, right? I had a very real, emotional, personal, spiritual relationship with God that I was practicing. But there was this intellectual foundation that whenever I had a doubt, I would kind of retreat to this intellectual foundation. And all of a sudden, those people I'd been trusting in, I began to doubt that I had been shown the truth or told the truth about other things, right? There was something I'd been told about the Old Testament, and that was the Old Testament is always supported by archaeological evidence. I'd heard that from so many Christians. It's like, sometimes they see something in the Bible and they're like, well, there's no evidence for that. And then they dig a little bit deeper and they're like, oh, we found the evidence. Or they find basically the idea that the Bible is always vindicated because the Bible is completely true in everything that it touches upon. But when I really looked into it, I started realizing that that's not true. That's not really the case. The place that I had sort of put a barrier around and said, we're not going there. Sure, we can talk about evolution, we can talk about the historicity of the Old Testament, but where I'm not gonna go is I'm not gonna go to Jesus. I'm not gonna question Jesus, but I just couldn't help myself because I was like, my understanding of who Jesus is not just based on my experience with him personally, but it's also based on what the Bible has to say about him. This is how we know what there is to know about Jesus.
If you're unfamiliar with what deconstruction is the process of analyzing and taking apart and hopefully re-putting back together the views of one's faith. And usually this is a very healthy and natural process in one's faith journey, but sometimes the pieces get left on the floor and never get put back together again. I think there's two reasons why people deconstruct. The first reason is that they just genuinely have questions. They have serious questions that come from a good place. They're curious. I think that's what's happening with Rhett in this video. The second reason is people are upset with God, with somebody who represents God in their life, with a pastor or whatever, through hurt, through pain, through trauma. We're not gonna address that in this video, but we are gonna talk about the first one. The average person usually has heard somebody say something that is a bit challenging to their faith, and usually sends them in some sort of spiral where they're trying to put the pieces of their faith back together. This is normal, and this is actually okay. Although I do believe this is a death sentence for many Christians based upon one fact. Facts. We see this in the video right here with Rhett and Link. They are relying, and most people are relying on facts to form their faith. They're relying on biblical facts to form their faith. When in reality, this is actually not the way that Jesus intended it. For many people in the scriptures, they had much more than philosophical or cultural arguments or just trying to grit their teeth and trying to push through in faith. They actually had something that they could touch, something they could feel, something that they could not deny, something that nobody or no thing could take from them. Think about Thomas. Thomas is told, hey, Jesus is risen. He's come back, and he says, I'm not going to believe until I touch him. Let's also look at this verse from the Apostle Paul. And I, brethren, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom, declaring to you the testimony of God, for I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. And my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in the demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but the power of God. Paul is stating here that he did not convince the Corinthians with mere words, but he actually convinced them with acts of divine, miraculous power. Simply put, no one argues with an empty wheelchair. I believe one of the main reasons for the proliferation of deconstruction is the absence of the gifts of the Spirit, of miraculous workings of power in many of our mainline denominations, including the one that Rhett and Link came from. This is why deconstruction is happening primarily, although not exclusively, in cessationist churches. I know we would all love the idea that we just believe in God and that's going to be enough, and we just kind of hope in our heart and that's all we need. We never need anything physical or tangible, but that's just not the biblical example. It's not the biblical testimony. John 20 says this, but these things are written to you so that you may believe that Jesus Christ is Son of God, and that believing in his name, you have life in his name. Now, the podcast is actually significant because I myself went through a season of deconstruction. And when I was in my deconstruction, that video will come later, the description of it in the story, I had questions about the historical integrity of the scriptures. And just, if I'm being honest, the fantastical claims of the scriptures, of the Bible, or even God himself. I remember asking myself, do I really believe at one point in time on this planet there was a pillar of fire traveling around the Sinai Peninsula? I would lie awake in my bed many nights, tears streaming down my face, because I was the pastor, I was in full-time ministry, feeling the bedrock of my life, everything I had built on, crumbling. I didn't want to doubt. I didn't want to doubt at all. This is a common misconception of people who don't understand this, is they think, well, they just wanted to leave. Many people who go through deconstruction don't want to leave Christianity. It's the bedrock of their entire life. However, in the midst of all that doubt, all my questions, all that sort of stuff, there was one thing keeping me in the conversation with God. I would remember lying in bed, all these questions, waves of doubt, waves of just thought about, is this true? Is that true? And I would have this pervasive little earworm thought in my mind, but what about the miraculous things that I had seen? Because here's the thing, I had seen things in my journey with God. More specifically, I had seen things that I could not explain, not in the slightest. Things that violated the laws of nature, small things like supernatural provision that went way beyond coincidence, all the way to crippled hands expanding out as I prayed, and cancer literally being taken out of a body and doctors having no explanation for it. I had seen these things firsthand, my wife seeing blind eyes, milky eyes turn clear at the touch of her hand. Unfortunately, many Christians don't have that testimony. Rhett and Link come from a background where the gifts of the Spirit are not taught nor practiced, actually taught against. And so when you step up against the tidal wave of doubt, all you have is the scriptures. In the sense, that's what Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians. If you can be argued into something, you can be argued out of something, but nobody can argue with an empty wheelchair. If you or someone you love is struggling with deconstruction, the answer is not to try to answer all their questions, because they're gonna have more questions. The answer is to give them something like Thomas that silences the questions. We are called to walk in faith, but make no mistake, God wants you to physically touch him. He wants himself to be manifest in your life. So much so that it becomes the bedrock of your life. It becomes like, I have seen the Lord. I believe one of the biggest things that will destroy the deconstruction movement is the gifts of the Spirit being manifest in the church. I love you guys. Hope to catch you next time. Peace.